Welcome everyone to CADAF panel related to digital art and copyright. It's a big topic today, and actually very glad to have our guests who are sort of dedicating their time to us. I just want to introduce them briefly to you. Today we have Cynthia Gayton, an attorney at Gayton Law. We have Mark Waugh, Business Development Director of DACS, and Dominic Perini, the co-founder of MoCDA, the Museum of Contemporary and Digital Art. So welcome again. I mean, this is I say this to actually all the panels, which is true, but it is every time sort of moderating, it's incredibly interesting. But today, even more so, because copyright is something that I've always found fascinating, but also incredibly challenging to actually understand it correctly. And for whoever is working, like me, a professional in the art world, but also for artists to make sure that they are protected. So for the purpose of sort of our audience who some people may be new to copyright, I just wanted to ask you, perhaps Cynthia, you can tell us a little bit more from a legal point of view. What is copyright? Where does it apply? When does it apply? In the US, for example, or maybe just a sort of a global overview of this. And I know it's hard to sort of summarize it, but we're going to try.
Okay, well, I'll take it from the perspective of the United States. It's part of US Constitution, and it is intended to provide rights to authors and inventors to their works, and that includes the right to sell their works. And this was a very important attribute for the founders, who were both inventors and authors. So this is critical enough to be in the Constitution. So we have copyright law in the United States, and there are aspects of it that would be very lengthy. I could take up the whole time talking about the laws in the United States and copyright. But for purposes of understanding it from an international perspective, there are treaties that have been entered into the World Intellectual Property Organization. There's TRIPS, there's several trade agreements that deal with intellectual property. And for purposes of authors and inventors, including artists generally, they are covered under these treaties. So each member state has their own intellectual property laws, and there has been an intention with the treaties to have respect for the laws of each state that enters into these agreements. There's the Berne Convention, there's the TRIPS agreement that cover these issues. So for purposes of this discussion, I think that the important thing for artists to understand is that first, their jurisdiction has laws dealing with copyright, and then there are international components. And that's what's interesting from right now, is how important the international element of copyright protection is right now. I mean, the United States takes it for granted that people will comply with US law and copyright, but we are being reintroduced to, and we've talked about this, we might talk about some more with regard to moral rights that artists have in their works. It is not automatically recognized in the United States, but it is very much an aspect of rights in other countries. So this is actually a very interesting time, and copyright is always a very interesting subject. But as we look at the international scope, especially with digital works that can go anywhere, and it's not just physical, this is a very important subject, at least in my opinion. So hopefully that'll give you a broad sense. So basically in the United States, you have the right to sell your work, make copies of your work, display your work, all of those things that impact certainly the internet. And there has, of course, we're dealing with piracy online, those kinds of things, and it doesn't diminish the rights that artists have. The difficulty for artists is enforcing whatever rights they have. And that has been compounded by free distribution of works often without the artist's knowledge or permission.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. I think perhaps Mark could tell us a little bit, before we delve deeper into the challenges of the digital works, what is the process of copyright in the physical sort of art market?
Yes, I suppose the interesting thing with the work of DACS is that DACS was established in 1984, and it was established by artists with some lawyers, and essentially that was at a time when the copyright laws were very familiar in the UK. In fact, it was Hogarth, the British artist, who first started protesting about the Pirates of Southwark, doing these crappy reproductions of his prints. So, from the UK, it goes back to the kind of the evolution of a popular market for images. And when in '84, DACS was established to actually think about the opportunity for artists to license their work, to gain some remuneration for the reproduction of their books, images, mainly in books. So 1984, pre-internet, blah, blah, blah. This is catalogs and publications, and maybe some kind of merchandise or something like this. But that is essentially was the job of DACS. It's dealing with people's rights to exploit commercially the artist's image. And what we do is I suppose we've evolved that business relationship over time, and it is very much about the interface between the jurisdiction in the UK and internationally. But as those, I suppose as the mechanisms of reproduction have accelerated to the point of infinity through the digital, all of the kind of questions, the conceptual questions about how you, I suppose, effectively manage those reproduction rights has become more critical to us as an organisation. So I guess that the important thing for us to state quite early on is that with copyright, you can assign it, but that doesn't happen automatically normally with a work. So, when Gerhard Richter or any artist who's working with an image and they sell it through an auction house, they don't automatically lose the right of that image when they sell the work, and they can retain that right regardless of the change in that value. And the other aspect which is really important to remember is that since 2006 in the UK, but before that with Droit de Suite in Europe, there is also an element of copyright, the artist's resale rights, which engages in the market value of that work. So with DACS now, we're very much involved in the questions of I suppose the management of copyright, but also the management of the artist's resale rights, and thinking about the implications in the technological sphere of, obviously technologies such as blockchain.
Can I mention something? Because this is really where US law and everybody else conflicts. The United States has a first sale doctrine. So with regard to a work, the creator does not have any future rights, no longer has any rights to that particular work. They do have a copyright that they retain, because copyrights can only be assigned in writing. So it can't be an oral agreement, it can't be anything else. So since we have first sale doctrine in the United States, and then there's a droit de suite in other countries, this is where there's a lot of misunderstanding based on jurisdiction. So if you have a situation where the creator retains a right, regardless of whether it's been resold, that is considered to be an encumbrance on the purchaser, and that from the United States perspective. But it is, something that's understood in other countries, that of course the artist or the creator retains an interest in the work beyond the sale. And this has been something I had, was hoping that blockchain as an example could help with bringing that idea to, at least from a contract perspective, because copyright has nothing to do with necessarily with the contract aspect of it. You can agree to do certain things as an artist, But still, in Europe, as far as I understand, in some countries in Europe, as far as I understand, you can't. It's inalienable that you can't give up as an artist. You can't give up that right. You can enter into some agreements, but generally, you don't give up your. It is part and parcel of being an artist that your intention goes along with the piece, and that idea is not really part of the culture in the United States. So it's very interesting how to solve this problem, because some people want to think, I don't want to have to deal with the artist forever, and for other people it's like, well, of course you have to deal with the artist forever. So it's an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And again, we're still in the spheres of obviously physical artwork, but I've worked recently with an artist who's based in the UK. I mean, I agree, we dealt with copyright sort of every day. And I think the notion that the copyright stays with the artist, is inherent to the artist, is very much something that is taken for granted, at least sort of in the UK. But one of the challenges was, I think, thinking about, for example, reproduction in countries where there are no links to, or there is no sort of association similar to DACS. Because my understanding is obviously also now that, the Copyright Association in the US and DACS and other copyright association within sort of countries sort of speak to each other, and they try to have a sort of a common way, common approach. But, one country is, I know that now there is something that they're doing something in China, but for example, that for, in this case, physical arts, and that particular art is, there are a lot of reproductions of an image, for example, happening in China, where then it becomes difficult to implement copyright protection or the protection of the image of an artist.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting issue insofar as I think that when you're thinking about I suppose the globalization of the art market actually demands a kind of a globalization at the kind of current state. And in the context of China, certainly Southeast Asia, there's a growing kind of desire to ensure that the artistic legacy that they have in place is safeguarded through copyright and safeguarded through something like the artist resale rights, because as museum collectors are educated internationally and they come back to their local market and they see that their local artists are kind of quite vulnerable to exploitation unless they have some of these protections in place. So I think we're going to see over the next kind of decade a massive transformation in the way in which the protocols work internationally. And certainly you're right that we are involved in networks which are coordinated by WIPO, which is the Intellectual Property Office. And that's all about trying to find some consensus ground to work effectively at scale.
Dominic, maybe we can now talk a little bit about digital art. What are the challenges, do you think, about in the digital space? Let's start with an easy question.
Yeah, well, I wanted to get a picture on the state of the art when it comes to the technical perspective and the digital art perspective. I know there's a number of organizations out there that are driving social media, and this art circulates occasionally uncontrolled on social media. So I think perhaps both from the DACS perspective and from the Gayton law firm perspective, there could be also an explanation of how these issues are handled at the moment. And this involves not only digital art in the form of an artwork, but also photography and any other image. At the same time, I wanted to try to understand at this stage of development how those technologies like blockchain help controlling, if at all, because personally I'm involved in a number of blockchain projects, but so far I haven't had evidence that this type of technology has really helped resolving a contentious case or a dispute. And I would like to get the perspective from both from DACS and also from Gayton law firm on this.
Yeah, so I think that it's really interesting, a kind of a technological question in terms of kind of copyright. That, you know, the most simple untechnical question is, if we take ourselves back to 1984 and you think about copyright, where are you going to see it? You're going to maybe see it in a magazine, might have a little copyright, you know, a byline at the bottom of an image, copyright to someone. So, you know, in the general sense of what, you know, what is the metadata that attaches itself to an image? Often it's not been visible historically. So the idea that we're going to suddenly arrive in a contemporary moment when the metadata is really efficient and there is maybe naive. So we have to say to ourselves, you know, what mechanisms can you put in place to supersede this chaos of metadata which has preceded us? And that is a difficult question. So in terms of, you know, the data that it attaches itself to an image, in terms of, you know, what you can, you know, how you prove an image is an image which is copyrighted, I think it's hugely problematic. And we certainly have looked into a lot of watermarking technologies, etc. And we've, you know, either they're too expensive to work at scale, or they're too easily duped, if you like, or, you know, the kind of the watermarking is too easy to lose. So historically, our sense has been that you can, the absolutes around watermarking are not a solution for rights management for visual images, but they're part of a trajectory of technology which looks towards some resolution of the fallout between the image and its metadata. But for us, always the kind of questions have been, and you're right to identify it, how that really works at scale. So we've done work with actually blockchain and AI to create engines which basically trawl the net, and they identify blocks of images which have been, you know, I suppose, used illegally by someone online, and we identify it by scale. And if the block is particularly large, we might then pursue it with an infringement. But what we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years is a number of different entities build engines, which basically are AI engines, which crawl the internet, and then when they find infringing works, you know, based on their client list, they'll then issue them takedown messages, and those are kind of quite aggressive, and they tend to fall very quickly to a very low common denominator. Insofar as, you know, where a license might maybe cost 100, they would quickly fall to something, well, if you give us £10, then we'll say it's quit. So I think the kind of question about the relationship, about the distribution of images and what technologies are in place, we're still at a very early stage of seeing the AI and watermarking work. And in terms of blockchain, I think that that's much, much more interesting, because I think that blockchain is less about the kind of the illusion of watermarking, and it's much more about the infrastructure of smart contracts. That is where we're going to go towards. And then I suppose some of the more interesting things we've seen are where people are building technologies which are mobile and robust in terms of creating not watermarking, but I suppose 3D mapping of objects and surfaces at a resolution high enough to identify whether something is the same thing it was in another space. So those technologies are evolving very fast with the understanding of what smart contracts can do. And I do think that's a big shift, but it's not around the illusion of standard watermarking or something like that.
Thank you.
A couple of things that I've noticed just recently. First, what are you trying to prove with blockchain? because it really is just a timestamp. And copyright law allows for people to come up with an identical thing, an identical image, and both would be entitled to copyright protection. So you can't necessarily say anything about the authenticity of something if you have something in place that says, as long as there hasn't been infringement or evidence of infringement, you can come up with the identical image at the same time and still be subject to copyright, as long as it is put down in a tangible medium of expression, which is a requirement in the United States. So if you're trying to use blockchain as evidence of copyright, that's going to mess you up. It can only be evidence of that this thing happened. It really is just a timestamp in that sense. And then the other problem with blockchain is, since people can't, in very few exceptions, is the art actually on the blockchain, right? So the art is stored separately from blockchain itself, the transaction itself. So you have an additional problem using blockchain as any way of showing copyright ownership. And then on top of that, in the United States and in other places, the United States got rid of the requirement that you have C in a circle to indicate copyright on your works in order to comply with the international standard that you don't have to put C in a circle. So even when people were trying to say, I have a copyright interest in this work, as a standard, it is not necessary for you to put C in the circle to indicate copyright. While I recommend it to people, at least you're asserting copyright. That's better than nothing at all. But the blockchain as and maybe we can get into this later, but I had learned about something that's going on with tokens that just made my head explode this past week. So we can talk about that later, because this isn't all about tokens, but in any event, those are my comments about using the blockchain for copyright purposes.
I mean, I think that the issue around the kind of, so in theory, someone can say, I'm going to make a work today and I'm going to make it and it's going to be a blue hand. And someone in another country at the same time can say, I'm going to make a work today, it's going to be a blue hand. And those works can be identical, and that absolutely is a reality. So, and it's a really, philosophically, what you're saying is true. But I think in terms of the way that the art market actually works and the way that art works, is it's really unlikely that you're going to have two artists in two different parts of the world immediately, every time they think of a new artwork, they're going to be, so today they both do blue hand, and tomorrow they do grey hand, then the next day they do yellow hand, synchronous. So the idea of the kind of the duplicity of two authors in the world is a possible, but actually what happens is over time, and I'm speaking to this really from a lot of work we do with artists in their studios, and we do legacy management with them, and it's all about thinking about their inventories and the kind of the way they manage their inventories, and fundamentally the relationship of kind of contracts, if you like, certification, etc., really evolves out of this long question about how an artist manages their inventory and how they manage their studio practice. And all of that is a chronological issue that resolves itself in a catalogue raisonné at some point. So our interest is about the timestamp. It's specifically how you converge data in a way which is convincing. And not only the data of this is an artwork in a given time, but this is an artwork which relates to another artwork, which builds up to an oeuvre. And the sense of that's why, for me, blockchain and smart contracts are a bit of a breakthrough in terms of this inventory management, because they build an ontological model of an artwork.
Yes. Yeah, precisely.
Well, the other aspect of this that I've been investigating for a while now is data integrity, because the metadata that people rely on, the images that people rely on, unless you have somebody going back and making sure, and of course, if you are in the business of assuring that the work is from the person they say it's from. That's a whole other thing, because you are actually adding to that information. But data integrity, where people are messing with the metadata, because they are, that is not necessarily being checked, in my opinion, because a lot of these projects are open source. People can do what they will with it, which has some advantage. But data integrity, in terms of what should be going on, in my opinion, with blockchain right now, that should be a number of people's full-time job, is making sure that the data is accurate, that the files associated with tokens are accurate, and because otherwise you're not going to have the confidence for your general, not people who are, in this professionally, or even collectors on a large scale. But you want to make sure, if you're going to make these purchases, that the information is accurate. And I don't see a lot of that. Obviously, there are people who that's part of their business model. But for the average person, that's not part of what they do, is make sure the data is correct.
Yeah, from a blockchain perspective, what you're referring to is called the Oracle. So an external trusted party that we trust, in the sense that we believe it inserts accurate data, and this is not yet happening. So having an immutable historic timestamp, but I assure there's a bit more than that in a blockchain. Perhaps it's not sufficient. There needs to be also associated data that are reliable. And I'm glad you touched on this subject. And I have a question for you specifically, Cynthia. Given that you say that at this stage, this proof that might emerge from a blockchain, from this timestamp, from this immutable record, is not usable in a legal context right now. What is it missing? What can be enhanced? Is it a narrative form that would be more beneficial? Or is it accuracy, as you mentioned, or anything else that you see that is missing?
But can be used as evidence of you having created the thing. I mean, it would be, any attorney worth his or her salt would have several pieces of evidence to support whether or not somebody created a work. So this would be one thing. If that were what I was trying to show, I would have everything I could possibly have to show that my client created that work. And one of those things could potentially be that blockchain entry. So if it would be cumulative. And I think because we know, how artists work generally, they would have their own files, they would have their own records. And that's something I always encourage whether physical or digital artists, to keep records of when and how they did their work. In fact, I give clients notebooks to keep physical records, because digital ones, bad things happen to them sometimes. But it's cumulative. So anyone who relies on one piece of evidence in the sense of proving copyright might be at a disadvantage. And especially, for example, in the United States, in order to bring an infringement action for copyright infringement action, not a contract breach, you actually have to have recorded your work with the Copyright Office. So again, the blockchain is just a piece to show something, but in order to make a copyright claim in the United States, you'd actually have to have filed the work with the Copyright Office. So it's not so much that the blockchain itself is bad in terms of these things. It just wouldn't be sufficient because there are other legal requirements in order to make your case.
Okay.
Mark, would that be the same in the UK, for example, that you would have to have a physical evidence or have to register?
No.
Copyright?
No, not at all. No. Cynthia, in the UK, it's just automatic. You know,
you have the well, the right to copyright is automatic, but if you want to bring this is, you know, been confirmed recently in front of the Supreme Court, that you have to have filed if you want to bring a copyright infringement action, because in the United States, you get statutory damages for infringement. So in order to get the statutory damages, meaning that, you know, basically the federal government is behind your claim, because if you file with the Copyright Office, the federal government is behind you. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't have a breach of contract claim if somebody uses your work without permission, or they had permission and they didn't pay you. Those are breach of contract claims, so that's a little bit different. You are entitled to copyright upon you're putting it in a tangible medium of expression, but in order to make a copyright claim using the benefit of the federal government, you have to file with the Copyright Office. So this is also very interesting in the sense that, let's say that you didn't. Your difficulty, as with most people, especially in the digital world, is proving damages. So most people, when they want to bring a copyright claim, they want to get money from someone. If you find that your work is all over the internet, how do you show damages? It's really hard to show how you've been financially damaged when you can't possibly find all the instances of your work and whether or not somebody made money from that. So I first started getting in copyright as dealing with the music industry, and that was a rabbit hole, you know, beyond measure, trying to find people who were infringing upon music. So in any event, you could have what would be called the common law claim if you could show damages for somebody infringing on your work. But recently, it's been decided that in order to get the benefit of the copyright laws and you want to make a copyright infringement claim, you have to file with the Copyright Office. It's $35. It's, you know, it's a small amount to protect your works.
Yeah, but yeah, in England and in Europe, it's different to that insofar as it's just yeah, it's automatic, and if you think you have a claim, then you can try and make a case for that, and that's certainly what DACS does on the behalf of all of our members. So what we do is we'll handle the I suppose the communication around what the infringement has been, and then also the calculation of what the damage has been, and that's predicated on the licenses that we issue commercially. So basically, we know what the commercial tariffs are, and we do kind of like for like. And then we say to someone, well, if you're taking out a license, it'll cost you this much. Because it's an infringement, you're going to pay a little bit of a penalty, but here, you know, sort it out like this. So it's quite practical, but it's not easy. And as I was saying, in relationship to kind of digital rights management and the kind of the use of AI across the field, it's not cost effective to be chasing everybody for infringements, and that's one of the bigger problems. It's just, you know, it's you know, you can see, you know, if a very large global brand infringes an image, it's obvious to see that there's money there, and it's obvious to see that it's worthwhile pursuing that to legal action. But in many cases, it's not. It's the same as the music industry. You know, there are many infringements, most of which are not pursued. And so, and you know, maybe that's a good thing in terms of kind of creative activity. But what we're talking about here is, you know, there are economics where you want to make artists benefit and be remunerated for their works, and that's our main area of business. And it's thinking about the future in ways which to support the artists to do that. And as I say, going back to it, from our point of view, it's about creating that ontological model of their work and creating data sets which are robust for the future. So for our organization, you know, we've been established since 1984. You know, if we're still around in you know 20 years time, 100 years time, you know, who's going to be looking after that data? And so we've begun to think, and again, in really simple terms, you know, organizations use data all of the time. Their data strategies are probably totally incoherent. And so for an organization dealing with data which spans, you know, 70 years of an artist's life, a copyright after they die, and an artist might live to 100. That's 170 years worth of accumulating data just on one artist. So, what kind of data are you going to be thinking of in the future which are robust? And that's again where interfaces between AI and blockchain become relevant, because it's scale modeled.
Yeah, that's very important to make it scale, indeed. I wanted to touch again on the subject of trust and trust of these third parties involved, or even the trust that relies on the identification of the artist or the identification of the artwork itself. And I'm trying to picture in my mind scenarios in which these infringements occur, and all of them, to me, they lead to a form of leak that happens somewhere. There might be a malicious intention behind this leak, or there might be a breach, but generally there is a malicious intention. This can happen at a level of the artist. It can happen at a level of a gallery. It can happen at a level of a tech supplier. And I was wondering if how this could be improved in terms of providing evidence that there's been a leak in order to identify a potentially malicious infringement.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, the answer there is informing artists that is the main issue. The main issue absolutely is a leak of data, and if they're not thinking about their work as in many senses, data sets which are vulnerable every time they're shared, they're going to leak and they're going to be vulnerable. So I suppose from our point of view, what we do is we look into protecting any data we share of artists, but we're also always looking for technologies which understand that issue and build essentially some form of data management or sort of CRM essentially into an artist's workflow, so they can recall in all of the kind of the transactions they've done in terms of transferring images to clients easily and understand where those leaks might have occurred. But I think that's one of the, evidently with something like, Instagram, an artist, they've no idea, once an image goes into Instagram, they've got no idea where it's going, so that leak is global. Yeah. But all they can do is be a bit sensible about the resolution of images that they share.
Yeah. That's definitely true. The biggest thing I have a problem with is I don't share any opinion on Google Docs, as an example. But many people use these tools to share information that they don't think that it's a leak, because only certain people are supposed to have access to these things. I've had instances personally that a document that I worked on as an attorney that the client asked me to work on comes back to me with edits years later that I shouldn't be on anymore. I shouldn't even be included in these things. So until people are aware of how information can be leaked, because of course with them, they're not thinking that that's a leak, but they don't know how other people are using that information. They can't control, because it's very easy to download it to your own computer. When you could have a disgruntled employee. It's a similar thing with any scenario with a security breach, is who's using it, how do you control access, how diligent are you to make sure that the people who were on the project last week are not on it today. So this is it's pervasive, and part of the idea of economic espionage, certainly with especially with valuable works, even intellectual property on a different level, is not as diligently reviewed as I would personally like. People think I have a mantra, like every 6 months I'll put something on Twitter as I read the terms and conditions, because a lot of people don't understand that people can use your works. If you post it on Instagram, it's right there that tells you how Facebook basically is going to use your work. And it's always stunning to, for the person who finally reads the terms and conditions. Oh, well, they can use my work for training AI. Oh, they can use any one of their affiliate organizations can use my work, completely unaware of how their work is being used. And we're all convinced that in order to be successful, you have to put your work on certain platforms. I did a test for myself, for example, to see the effectiveness of somebody, an organization that said that they checked to make sure that my work didn't infringe on anybody else's work. So I knew my work was out there. I have a pretend file that I set up and I submitted to be on the blockchain, my particular work, and they supposedly did a check. They came back and said, oh, we didn't find this anywhere. And I knew that I had put it someplace. So all of these things have to work together really well. And even though the mantra has been, certainly with blockchain, is we don't want third parties, we don't want third parties. I think third parties in this case, certainly we talked about oracles, have to be there somewhere. But again, who wants to take responsibility for those breaches or those errors? That's the bigger problem, is who wants to be responsible for it, because I can tell you there are a lot of people who don't want to. And it's been a real challenge these past few years. Just the accountability issues and the responsibility issues are in some respects probably overwhelming for some people.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that, and it seems that you both agree that there is a need to have more education and information that goes out on how this information circulates on the internet, on several medium. I think this is definitely how it should be handled in the immediate term. Definitely we should go out and let people be more aware of what happens if they publish their artwork on Instagram versus Google Docs or something else. That is definitely valuable. Another angle of this is that this leak in the protection of this information, especially when we talk about metadata, but we could talk about the artwork itself, I think poses an interesting question for the future. So assuming that there is only one trusted entity that keeps an accurate record protected, and this entity ceases to exist in the future. So with it, we will lose all the possibility to use that those records as an evidence, because the record will disappear as well, or at least it is a possibility that it disappears. So I'm thinking, how do you think this could be resolved? Because I think blockchain also has that aim. Of course, it hasn't yet reached that far, but it has got also the aim of distributing some of this information, so distributing metadata, but occasionally even artworks themselves, even in So there are some blockchains, they are called block weaves, and they store actual data in large size on a blockchain. And I was wondering, how do you see this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, really simple way to think this through is that when you think about the contemporary artist, you can still think about an artist painting. You still can think about an artist whose performance is just the blowing of a breath, a performance artist. You can think about all types of artists, but as soon as you begin to start thinking about a digital artist, all of these crises of data and information become really focused. Because, and there's a good example, the artist, British artist called Stuart Croft, filmmaker, teacher. He died very unexpectedly, and essentially no one could get into his computers. No one could get into his computers because they didn't know his passwords. So it took a long time to get someone who's technically competent enough to be able to hack into that computer to get that data out. And that was only possible because this was like, I think 4 years ago now, still the encryption was quite fairly rudimentary. As we progress with encryption, these kind of challenges will just get more and more severe. So when you think about blockchain, you have to think about kind of the way in which you configure basically people's key access into accounts, and think about mechanisms for safeguarding those, and thinking about mechanisms for safeguarding those in the absence of memory, and what those conditions for access then become. And I don't think anyone has sorted it out, but certainly with DACS and the blockchain work we're doing, those are some of the key elements we are thinking about, because those are big challenges. But they're no bigger than the idea of someone dying and losing their password, because that's fundamental to an artist.
Absolutely. Yes.
I have recently, as I help artists with their, they're coming up with wills, they're coming up with their trusts, things like that, including language with regard to keys and passwords related to if they have any work on blockchain. And so these issues go to not only legacy planning for individuals, but also if you are responsible as a holder of someone else's information on their behalf. What happens when a key person in an organization dies and they had all the records related to an artist or somebody like that, the custody issues. And that, I think, is going to grow almost exponentially as whether it's blockchain or some other digital realm, planning for these things, because this is not new. Legacy planning, custody planning, all these things exist in the physical space as well. But I know a lot of people who have forgotten their key phrases and their seed phrases for the crypto. People have lost money. So if people are losing Bitcoin or Ether as a result of misplacing a key, that's a problem we'll all have to face. So and so again, I have everything written down in like 9 different places, and hoping that if anything happens to me, somebody will know to look in a particular spot. But what are people doing it? They're leaving it on their computers and they're leaving it on their phones. And of course, other people have access, not your keys, not your crypto, those kinds of things.
Sure.
But that exists also in the physical world, is how do you plan for the future? Who's responsible?
Absolutely. I have no doubt that it applies also to the physical world. However, my perception is that perhaps this was pitched with an excessive emphasis in the blockchain space, but the ambition is precisely to share and use the consensus form. So if this data is replicated a number of times, this peer-to-peer network effectively has an effect of converging towards a version of the history. And regardless to how the history in reality played out, that can be used in the future as an evidence of a sequence of events. And even further than just a sequence of events, it could even become a cause and effect sort of dependency, which I think is highly valuable from the legal perspective. And this comes into play, especially when you apply smart contracts, as Mark mentioned before. So I think there's an exciting and unexplored perspective in that sense.
Yeah, the collaboration with smart contracts in particular, because if you are an artist and you are on a particular smart contract, the smart contract doesn't apply if you're on a different platform from which you made the sale, right? Because that's the intent. It is not intended for the smart contract to apply on every platform, buying and selling platform. So there has to be an incentive for the people who participate in this particular market to have some agreement with regard to sharing smart contract information, so that it isn't, you aren't locked in as an artist in some respects, because I'm seeing a lot of issues with that right now. That you can hopefully, if you are looking for your supposed royalties, which really are just commissions, if you're looking for your commission payments on future sales, then you as an artist should not care where the piece is sold, right? And that's the thing with some of the physical art, that is, people are trying to mimic that physical art situation in the digital world, but it's very different, because the reason why the physical art royalties persist is because it's about the artist's right to the work. The way these things are designed is the reseller. The reseller is not necessarily the artist, right? So the reseller, for the royalty rights, you have to be the creator, and that's why it's protected in other countries. It has nothing to do with whether you get a commission on a sale. So you will be able to maintain those rights. So until there's pressure from someone, I don't know whether it should be the artists or someone, to say these smart contracts need to be interoperable somehow. I should be able to walk with my, because in regular world, I could walk with my contract, physical contract, and have an amendment to the contract that says transfer my interest to X entity, and they can negotiate on the price for that, and we can move on. Everybody can move on with the physical contract. It's really difficult to do blockchain, to have that kind of, we can amend it, we can make these changes.
I think, yeah, I think the idea of interoperability, though, is a big one in blockchain, and it's where lots of people are really interested. I think that the idea that there will be a singular dominant blockchain kind of space, that's, I don't think people think that. I think they think there will be a multiplicity, and if you have a multiplicity, you have to have design towards interoperability, and it'll be interesting to see how well that plays out. But certainly we're seeing lots of different tech companies coming up with solutions which would basically work through APIs through various platforms, and I think that is likely to be the future, because people will want to replicate that sense that entities can easily shift across the sphere. But again, I mean, I suppose going back to the fundamentals of copyright, I think for me, the interesting connection between kind of blockchain and copyright is a return to thinking about what kind of rights an artist would want, and those kind of economic remuneration, moral rights, and in some ways, the moral rights and the remuneration smart contracts are really fascinating, because they're also potentially rights around collaboration, etc. And so this notion that you begin to embed within the kind of the contractual space, the memory of, well, these were the ethical agreements we had at the time. When we were making this work as a collective, we all thought we were a collective, and we wanted to fairly distribute those monies. So I think that these kind of aspects of the way in which copyright is being revisited is something really critical, because essentially copyright is worthless unless someone wants to exploit an image. So that worthlessness is a brilliant thing to contemplate, because you can speculate about how you want it to be shared, because it doesn't, it's a non-entity until it becomes meaningful. And I think that this new generation are really thinking through how they would understand that kind of sense of distributed responsibility and engagement over time, when they may not be together anymore. In other words, that they may come to collab really intensely for a very short period of time to make works together, and then that won't be the case in some other time, but that intensity is kind of fixed in some kind of digital glue, which then kind of carries forward. So I think that these are really kind of fascinating traces that we're beginning to leave in terms of thinking about what the legacy of copyright is from that, as I say, the early printing press, which Hogarth was saying, no, my plates were exhausted by this time, don't use them. through to this sense of, yeah, when you've got 14 different people working on different code to make an artwork happen, how do they share that ownership and authorship? So yeah, these are fascinating frontiers, really.
And it's definitely changing because there are cultural changes. What the understanding is for the United States is a very static, one person, maybe a handful of people who intended at the time for copyright to exist. Other countries have a cultural perspective with regard to copyright. The copyright belongs to the community, which is antithetical to what the United States thinks about art. But the collaborative aspect of it is very interesting because how do you have collaborations go over time? There could be modifications and derivative works that you all agree to as artists. You agree to these modifications. So how do you exploit it? But how the copyright laws don't really address that, because then you're always making derivative works. Then you're always having to, you know, change these things. And that's where I think, like, I want to see something like that more in blockchain, where they're adding people as collaborators. I'm not sure that they'd be able to get copyright protection though. However, it doesn't matter if the parties agree to how to share and divide up whatever it is that they think that they own. I think you definitely have the right as a contract perspective to do that. It might push copyright to take into consideration some cultural things, as well as this is how artists work things. You know, this is a reality type situations, because just because somebody filed for a copyright, that doesn't necessarily mean that was the only person who was involved. There are often collaborators that are unnamed. So how are these are the kinds of things I'm hoping this pushes forward. I think we're in some respects a little bit stuck.
I agree.
Can't think about how this possibly could be, because everybody's thinking about how do we manage this? How do we manage it? As whether you're the artist or the administrator or the legislator, how do you manage it? Artists are doing it anyway. So you either deal with the reality of how it's done. I gave an example with jazz musicians that would always give attribution to anyone who created some portion of the work earlier, and they always give attribution. That's one thing that's definitely missing that I want to push for too, is attribution. At least if you don't want to give somebody copyright on an interest in something that you did, at least give attribution that they helped with your idea about the thing. Attribution is just as valuable, in my opinion, as copyright, because at least your name gets out there, you get credit for what your contributions were, especially when there's no money involved. Attribution could build careers, just giving people credit.
Yes, but attribution doesn't have any legal sort of aspect to it, right?
If you have a contract that says you have to give attribution, because Creative Commons licenses, some of them require that you give attribution. So again, like it was discussed earlier, how do you check all of that? How do you check to make sure, especially with a Creative Commons license, that everybody that used the work has given attribution? It's really hard to do, and it is expensive to do. But it would technically be enforceable if you were, because it would be part of the contract, because you agreed to give attribution. If you didn't give attribution, you have been in breach of the contract. It's just hard to enforce.
I think first of all, thank you. But our conversation today reminded me of how this topic is, so we need to talk more, and we need to have more sort of conversations. And before, when we were planning this talk, we all agreed that there's definitely a need of more educational panels, such as this one. So I'm very glad to do this. But where would artists, and not just artists, but everyone working in the art world, so collectors, but also technicians, where could they possibly go if they wanted to actually get educated, understand more, or perhaps bring forward ideas on how to?
Can I take it?
Yes, definitely, please.
Sure. No, I think you touched on a very important subject. And even before aiming at coming up with a single winning blockchain, I think in terms of handling copyright, we have to converge towards an approach. And that hasn't been the case yet. There's, in my opinion, a lot of confusion, at least from the technical perspective, which I represent. But I believe also from the artist perspective and also from the collector's perspective, especially when it comes to digital art. And I think you pointed out to the fact that there's not enough exchange of information. And the result of this is that the technical guys go ahead and develop something that perhaps artists are not particularly happy about. People handling with the legal aspect are not particularly happy about. So I really encourage this conversation to happen more in the future, because my impression is that at this stage, artists don't know enough about the technical and the legal aspect. Technical people don't know enough about the artist perspective, nor the legal. And the legal people perhaps should learn more, both about the artist and also from the technical perspective. And I think I strongly encourage this conversation to progress.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because, you know, at DACS, we have, you know, I suppose we've followed some very practical steps in terms of the exploration of the education. That's kind of releasing things into the wild. You know, we've released a product which is called Bronze Chain, and it's a hallmark for bronzes because you have hallmarks in jewelry. Everybody understands that, and it's kind of like an ancient form of, you know, some timestamp in you know, have a maker's mark when it is made, what the kind of the you know what the value of the kind of carat is, etc. So, but there wasn't one for bronzes, and we thought, well, you know, there's an absence there, you know, because bronzes are worth so much in the art world. So, you know, we thought, well, we'll marry that kind of stamping technology with a blockchain. We'll do a certificate for foundries. They're the trusted people who are casting these editions. And when you roll it out, you know, you have to do the whole education about, you know, what's the difference between another certificate and a blockchain certificate, what documentation they have to supply at kind of point of creation, and then they have to also think about a physical stamp into a work. It's such a complicated process. You know, if you like the user acceptance testing of these products in the world are so complicated. And we have another product which we've just, you know, as a response to COVID-19, we have a platform called Videtilier, which is with a platform called Marcel. We're really interesting in terms of inventory management system because it uses what they call magnetic ID, which remembers the data on all of the assets on an inventory. And we've linked that up with our partners Verisart. So it's a platform selling editions, limited editions with certification during this kind of COVID situation. But again, you have to educate all of the participating artists in what those processes are, what the meanings of them are. And when we've done our deeper dive in terms of research, we've been working with Imperial, the Center for Cryptocurrency, and they're world leaders. And the students there knew nothing about art. So when we were asking them to build our pilot, we had to build from the bottom up their knowledge of how the art market worked, and then ask them to build this pilot for us. And they loved it. And they came up with technical elegance, really kind of smart moves around how we'd structure it. So they took all of that intelligence and they transferred it into, you know, contemporary, you know, of the moment thinking around kind of cryptography. But we realized then that there's this whole generation in London of, as you say, people who are working at the leading edge of crypto, and then all of these artists who are totally disenfranchised because they've got no idea that this stuff is moving at that speed. And so one of the things that DACS is certainly looking to do is create some kind of hub space, which will be this interface between artists and kind of technology designers to generate knowledge, because for us, it is about IP, fundamentally, thinking through IP. So it's ethical and kind of ingrained in the way we think about the evolution of the whole infrastructure. So I think it's a really important point, because having taken a few products to market and you just endlessly have to educate, it's got to be more systematic.
I've noticed a lot of artists recently who are creating physical works as well as their digital works, and which I think is a good thing, because now you have two collectibles, right? You have the physical collectible. I have at least 5 or 6 paper wallets that are associated with that, you know, they have the crypto on there. There are artists who are really pushing the physical aspect of it as well as the digital. I saw something the other day that you could download a PDF of the work and create the work yourself, as well as have the token. So there's all these different elements, so that creativity certainly has expanded in this space that I've seen in the past couple of years, where it isn't entirely digital, but it also helps confirm that the authenticity of the work. I used to have an art gallery. It was a steampunk art gallery, and I got the certificate of authenticity. I got the piece. I got, you know, so many things in support if I ever wanted to resell that thing, in support of that this is an authentic piece. And I'm seeing that evolution, but I definitely am not seeing, because the folks that I'm talking about are very much embedded in the technology space. So the artists who are kind of out having to rely on people to be trustworthy, that they are telling them the truth. I don't know if that's actually expanded, because it is such an esoteric. If you just want to sell your work, you just want to sell your work, and that's the, you know, that's the nuts and bolts of it. But that interaction, I think, exists a lot more in crypto than it did when I first started getting involved with crypto art generally. So I'm hopeful about it. I taught a class a couple years ago, and I created physical tokens for them to give them an idea about what it was. So they could look at the back of my physical token and they saw all the attributes of it, and I created fake hashes, and to give them an idea about what that is, and how I also used it to talk about fungibility versus non-fungibility, so they could understand those things. All of these things are tokens. That makes it fungible. The non-fungibility is each one of these things has a different number on it. So it helped with just that education, because they were all artists that I was talking to. So it's breaking it down into, you know, bite-sized pieces. And then it leads to what really is the intent. What are the goals? Because if you're not talking to artists about what they want, because most artists that I talk to, they don't want people to copy their stuff and not give them any money for it. That's mostly the piracy issue remains the biggest issue. And I haven't seen any, you know, solution that I would be satisfied with if I were an artist, that would give them that comfort. All I can do is say this can help you, but it's not really solving the piracy problem.
Cool. From my perspective, I can tell you that I'm very much interested in this subject about copyright, and I devoted most of my research in that direction from the technical perspective. So I'm conducting a research of my own in that respect, and I'm collaborating with artists. I'm under the MoCDA hood, and I'm delighted to learn more. And in fact, I was very happy to attend this panel because I think it gave me the opportunity to learn more and get to know you also. And what I'm trying to say is also that I encourage this form of collaboration also with the pioneers, the people that are not happy about the state of the art. So, Mark, before you mentioned academic of a very respectable background. I mean, the Imperial is quite a serious organization, which I totally respect. But at the same time, there are pioneers that explore new way of doing things, and I think it would be beneficial to try to influence those as well in order to do the right things, rather than finding out that the product that they have produced and released perhaps get traction but doesn't resolve much, for example, from a legal perspective. So I encourage this collaboration a lot.